I'm Mike Clegg. I'm Dean of the school. And thanks for coming with us to celebrate Alumni Day. This is the one day a year that we dedicate to alumni, and it's always great to see old friends and connect and have people get together. Over the last several years, we've worked hard to increase our outreach to alumni and to learn from alumni. And so we're really happy that you all made time in your busy schedules to come with us today. So my job is to introduce Peter Agre, who is a professor in our school and directs the Malaria Research Institute. He's also a Nobel laureate in chemistry. Peter graduated from the School of Medicine here in 1974 and trained in clinical internal medicine and hematology and basic science and cellular and molecular biology. And I met Peter for the first time in 1984 when I was a fellow in the School of Medicine, and his division chief, I can remember, was presenting what was the new and interesting things that were happening in hematology. And one of the things he did was to brag about that they were recruiting this young man who was going to be great in the lab and work on red cell membranes. He has always been interested in tropical diseases, and as a student worked at Bayview in geographic medicine on the mechanisms of diarrhea, but then concentrated on blood group antigens and especially the Rh antigen, hemolytic anemia, and then more recently malaria. So he got the Nobel Prize in 2003, and I remember that day because he was I was a vice dean in the School of Medicine, and he was trying to recruit me to do some cooperative things with Norway, with the University of Oslo. And we had a meeting on a Saturday morning with them, and they came. And we had a follow-up meeting scheduled, and I woke up and heard on the radio that Peter Agre won the Nobel Prize. I thought, this is great. And I got a meeting with him at noon. I'll take a bottle of champagne. So 6 months later, I saw him again. Peter's work was, while he was trying to isolate and work on the Rh antigen, he noticed a protein that was consistently present in the isolates, and then characterized it and found that it was the aquaporin, a water channel that allowed water to go back and forth between membranes. And it really changed the way we think about how cells work. And it's responsible for generation of all biological fluids, whether it's cerebrospinal fluid or aqueous humor or tears, sweat, saliva, anything. And they're widely present throughout nature. So we were very fortunate. Peter had left to go to Duke and was there in a leadership role, and then we were able to recruit him back to Hopkins and to our school to head the Malaria Research Institute. He had been working on aquaporins and the malaria parasite. And then in 2014, when we received a generous gift from Mike Bloomberg to create the Bloomberg Distinguished Professors, Peter was one of the first named as a BDP. But he's not going to talk about, I don't think you're talking about aquaporins today, no, not aquaporins. He is going to discuss our relationship to Cuba over the years, especially now that that there's an increased ability to go back and forth in relations between our countries. So I had the opportunity to travel with Peter and our Health Advisory Board. The Health Advisory Board is a board that provides advice to the school. It meets twice a year, and it's made of distinguished alumni and friends of the school, and provides advice to me. And so in 2015, we really, at the very beginning of the centennial, we traveled with our advisory board to Cuba, and Peter was our host. And we learned a lot about the universal healthcare system. You saw some of the pictures. There's a great picture of Peter in a famous bar and a famous hotel there. We visited a vaccine center and bioengineering institutes and met with government and scientific leaders. It was really a wonderful time. So Peter's going to talk about Cuba, and then we have allotted some time for Q&A, and Peter has a distinguished guest whom he will introduce, and we'll be able to talk. So please join me in welcoming Peter Agre to the podium.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Johns Hopkins Alumni Reunion. It's a privilege to be able to share some of our experiences with you. The centennial year for me, in part, began with our Health Advisory Board trip to Cuba. So what I plan to cover in the next half hour is show some photographs of our trips to Cuba, not just the health advisory trip, but a series of other trips I've been making over the last 7 years. Talk about science in Cuba with the theme that it all has to do with friendships, the relationships we have with each other. Then Luis Alberto Montero and I will have some time for questions at the end. So just for reference, if you've been to Cuba, would you raise your hand? Okay, it's still not too many, but it's possible with the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the interpretation of the guidelines were liberalized, and it's possible to go to Cuba for scientific and cultural exchanges. It's still not possible to go there as an American, as a tourist, but things are opening up, and really good things are happening. So those of you who have not been to Cuba, and that's most of you, I'd like to share some photographs of what it's like. Now, just the serious message here is that the United States has some problems with our image abroad in countries, Cuba being one of them. We project a lot of antagonism. And this is a poll published 12 years ago with the Carl Zogby firm, and as you can see, when the citizens of 5 moderate Arab countries are polled, there were feelings about the US in general. Most were unfavorably impressed with our country. But when the same individuals were polled for their impressions of the United States from the viewpoint of science and technology, and not a single kind of science, but agricultural science, health science, medical science, it was a completely different outcome. The majority now have a favorable view of the United States. So I think science is a special endeavor because it opens doors and creates friendships which would otherwise not occur. And I think our friendships with Cuba are expanding in part because of our scientific friendships. So Cuba, not a large country. The landmass is about the size of Pennsylvania, but it's 700 miles long. It's a long island just off the coast of Florida. 11 million people live there. And when you travel to Cuba, it's in some ways like traveling into the past, flying in from Florida, and it's now possible to come by commercial airlines. For the last 3 weeks now, commercial flights to Havana and Santa Clara are possible. You see that most of Cuba is agricultural, and it's been described as the world's largest organic garden because of the embargo since the revolution. Pesticides and fertilizers have been made very difficult in Cuba, so the agricultural industry is somewhat squelched. When we landed in Havana, we went to the sites as the Health Advisory Board, and the central parts of Havana have some well-known sites, the Jose Marti Memorial and Revolutionary Square. The edifice here, the shadows obscure it, this is an edifice of Che Guevara. And shown here is the edifice of Camilo Cienfuegos, hero from the revolution, and this is Manuel Reyes and his wife, 2 of our scientific colleagues in Havana. We visited the Nacional de Cuba Hotel, a famous hotel built in 1930, a popular destination for American tourists until the revolution. Beautiful architecture. The east wing of the hotel, however, was occupied by the Meyer-Lansky Corporation, an organized gambling endeavor, which was very profitable for Meyer-Lansky and the governments of Cuba before the revolution. The doorman is probably dressed the same as he was in 1930. So Mike mentioned some of the murals in the Hotel Nacional de Cuba, celebrating visitors from the past through the 1940s, Churchill, Cesar Romero, Cantinflas. And behind the bar, I don't know how this occurred, is a panel with a number of well-known leftist journalists, government leaders. Here's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and here are 2 American scientists, Peter Agre and Alan Roebuck. So sometimes the friendships are more vigorous than we realize. I've been sent this photo by a number of people asking me if I know that my picture is behind the bar. And I can't explain it, but I would point out I probably was not their best customer. So the Health Advisory Board visited a number of sites, and here we're having lunch at the residence of the American ambassador to Cuba. Of course, since the revolution, there's been no American ambassador. It's the American interest section. But it's the most beautiful ambassadorial residence in the Western Hemisphere, built by Franklin Roosevelt's administration in 1934. And we had a great time. Mike, you're in this picture somewhere, but it's a little hard to see you. So the architecture in Old Havana is exquisite. Here's the Havana Cathedral. Here's the train station. Some of the new architecture is less majestic. This is the Riviera Hotel built by Meyer Lansky with some of his profits to expand the business. And contemporary architecture is interesting because there's a lot of emphasis on the arts in Cuba. This is a sculptural garden that we visited. A lot of humor in the sculptures and in the posters. This is you can interpret this, beware of the dog. This is somebody's foot, apparently. The Capitol, the Capitolio, designed after the US Capitol. There were so many tight relations between Cuba and the United States. And from the old city looking through. In fact, I wonder if we could have the lights down a little bit, Scott. If we dim the lights, the pictures might be a little more visible. But of course, in the old city of Havana, there's some problems because of the mildew and the age, and need for investment to rejuvenate the architecture is pretty clear. But where there has been investment, the architecture is beautiful. They missed one. This is now a hotel in downtown Old Havana. Courtyards, majestic courtyards, another old hotel, and at night. So we had dinner at a variety of locations, including some old villas, which are now privately owned and operated, the Paradors. And these are delicious meals, but some of the old villas, as you can see, are in need of some repair. As Louis and I were driving down here today, he's pointed out that Baltimore and Havana have some architectural things in common. Some of our old architecture is in need of rejuvenation as well. And here's another meal of the Health Advisory Board in a downtown restaurant. And there is Mike Clegg, center of the party, as always, our hero. So the image of Hemingway is alive and well in Cuba. He lived in Cuba from 1939 to 1960. Hotel, one of his favorite hotels, the Florida, has a Tiffany glass ceiling, photographs of Ernest Hemingway. These are a couple of my colleagues from the AAAS from one of our trips. This is from his villa outside of Havana called Finca Villa, the Lookout Farm, where a lookout station overseeing the Atlantic Ocean, and the rooms which he occupied, and he wrote a number of books. The Old Man and the Sea, of course, in 1952 won him the Nobel Prize. And this is his famous boat, the Pilar. He loved that boat. It's a teakwood hull cabin cruiser fishing boat, originally registered in Key West, but now on display at the Hemingway Villa in Havana. So since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba has had economic challenges more than ever before, and tourist industry is one of the major industries. So there are many opportunities to have your picture taken with people. And I propose, Mike, this series could be used by the Johns Hopkins anti-smoking campaign, because this young man in the street with a majestic cigar finds us a local sucker. My mother always warned me not to smoke. It would lead to my demise, and I met these nice young ladies. They wanted $5 for this photograph. I don't know. Now, because of the embargo, since the revolution, the import of American products, and it's expanded to include any international products with American components, has been made impossible. So the old cars survive in Havana. Of course, the typical car on the street is not a pristine old car that has been renovated, but somewhat of a wreck. But the ones that have been renovated are lovely, and they tend to congregate at the airport and around the tourist hotels. Why don't we call out, what kind of car do you think this is? Anybody know? It's a what year? 37 Ford. Rumble seat. I don't know what kind of car this is. Clive, is this a Rhodesian Ridgeback or something?
It's a hybrid.
I think this is a 47 Ford. 47 Mercury, excuse me. 52 Chevrolet. Now, most of these have actually been renovated multiple times, and they probably have diesel engines, and they're on truck chassis, but they look great. 56 Chevrolet Bel Air, classic. And here's another one, 56 Chevy. So that's all very romantic, but the fact is it's very difficult for the people in Cuba because they cannot afford cars. Here's my favorite, 56 Ford with a political statement on the side. His image is very commonly seen in Havana. And this is the old fort at the end of the day across Havana Harbor. So the images which in the United States we project for the Cuban Revolution are usually like this. Castro and his colleagues coming from the mountains, ending the revolution and antagonizing the United States, which reciprocated and has led to a 66-year standoff, 56-year standoff. But I think in Cuba, the revolution is still celebrated with a lot of reverence. There's a lot of patriotism associated with this because the regime before the revolution was a terrible regime, Fulgencio Batista, supported by the CIA and the American underworld, and the Cuban workers were greatly disadvantaged. So there are remembrances of the revolution. On the side of the hotel, here's an armored car by the university, and many patriotic speeches of Fidel Castro prominently displayed. So even this many years after the revolution, I think Fidel remains a hero, but the era is ending, and of course, Che Guevara also. So this was one of the problems with the resolution of relations between our countries. These are the 5 Cubans who were held in American prisons, charged with treason for being intelligence agents. In fact, they were most likely spying upon anti-Castro groups in Miami that were planning terrorist activities in Cuba. But this has now been resolved, and as part of the agreement has led to opening of relations between our two countries. Now, science is a very important part of the Cuban economy. After the revolution, there was nothing. They had to rebuild healthcare and the scientific enterprise. And it came from the top. Fidel Castro himself was a lawyer, not a scientist, but I'll show you pictures of his family members. His son, also named Fidel Castro, Fidelito, is a physicist, as is his grandson, Fidel Antonio. And in a speech, famous speech made not long after the revolution, he said, "The future of Cuba is the future of the men and will be brought by the men and women of science." And they invested significantly in science, and also so in the provision of health care and the generation of physicians to the world. This was also articulated by Che Guevara in a visit to the Cuban National Academy a couple of years, 3 years after the revolution. This was an important way forward for Cuba. And one of the first efforts Castro and Che Guevara led was a meeting with the Pan American Health Organization, where they outlined a plan to control and eliminate malaria from Cuba. It was endemic in Cuba before the revolution. It's still endemic in Haiti. But by public health measures, what D.A. Henderson would call shoe leather public health, they eliminated malaria from Cuba by using larvicidals, aggressive treatments, building houses away from the swampy areas. So they took their promises very seriously. Now, this is the capital, again, as I mentioned, designed similar to the U.S. Capitol, and this was also the home in some of the offices of the Cuban National Academy of Sciences, which is treated like a government ministry. This is Sergio Pastrana on the left, the Secretary General of the Cuban Academy of Sciences, and me in one of our first meetings. This is 6 years ago. And we've had recurrent meetings, and a friendship has developed. This is a meeting of the AAAS group who visited Havana in 2014, planning activities, collaborations, ways of bringing our countries together through science. One of the most recent activities being planned is a meeting of the Johns Hopkins Vector Biology Group, the Vector Encounter meeting, to be held in Havana next spring. So the headquarters of the Cuban Academy now is in the museum named for Carlos Finley, and it's a beautiful antique building refurbished. And it's named after Carlos Finley for a very good reason. Finley is not a name well known in the United States, but he probably should be because he is a national hero in Cuba. He is the one that first predicted that yellow fever, a scourge in the Caribbean and in the United States, that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes, the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. And this was long before Ronald Ross demonstrated the same for malaria. So Finley was a major figure and a hero of the Yellow Fever Commission. And there's a statue of him inside and another one outside of the headquarters of the Cuban Academy of Sciences. So Carlos Finley, father was Scottish, his mother was French. He was raised in Cuba, came to the United States for his medical education at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and returned to Cuba as both a practitioner and as a scientist, an early entomologist. He had an insectary, probably nothing as nice as what we have here at the Bloomberg School, but with the same idea. By studying mosquitoes, he could get to the bottom of what he thought was mosquito-borne diseases, and he was correct. He had the hypothesis that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes, but was unable to demonstrate it. And the reason is there's an incubation period of about 10 to 12 days between a mosquito biting an infected yellow fever patient before the mosquito is ripe and can then infect another individual. So Finley had the hypothesis. And of course, yellow fever in the 19th century was horrific. In the United States, as many as 100,000 people may have died of yellow fever. During the Spanish-American War, which only lasted 4 months, of the American casualties, 400 died because of combat, and 2,500 died from yellow fever. It was a huge scourge. So also in the Cuban National Academy of Sciences is this engraved placard with the name in the lower right of Jesse Lazier. Does anybody here know who Jesse Lazier was? Is that a familiar name? A few hands. 2 hands. Mike knows, but Mike knows everything. So Jesse Lazier was a hero who was part of the Yellow Fever Commission. Now, the Yellow Fever Commission followed the Spanish-American War because in 1900, the war was over and the American occupation led by General Leonard Wood, who was the Governor General of Cuba. And Leonard Wood was a medical doctor. They were faced with a huge epidemic of yellow fever. Walter Reed actually was a Virginian, graduated from the University of Virginia Medical School at the age of 17. The reason is that was the shortest curriculum he could find. His parents didn't have enough money for a full academic baccalaureate. He then went on to New York University, Bellevue Hospital for clinical training, joined the U.S. Army Medical Corps, and while in the Medical Corps, stationed at Fort McHenry, studied bacteriology at Johns Hopkins with William Henry Welch. Before he founded the School of Public Health, he was the professor of pathology. And because of his expertise in bacteriology and microbiology, it was decided by the U.S. Surgeon General, George Miller Sternberg, that Walter Reed would be a good individual to lead a commission of physicians to figure out what's causing yellow fever to see if it could be brought under control. So Walter Reed actually didn't know much about the vector transmission hypothesis of Finley, but his colleague, junior colleague, Jesse Lazier did. Jesse Lazier was a Johns Hopkins undergraduate, a really vigorous guy. He used to hike from Baltimore to Canada and back in the summer to stay in shape. And he studied medicine at Columbia University. He returned to Johns Hopkins where he studied bacteriology and clinical pathology with William Henry Welch. He was an instructor. He was basically Welch's right-hand man in the Department of Pathology. And he, along with James Carroll from the University of Maryland and Aristotle Aristide, a Cuban-born American, became the contract physicians with the Yellow Fever Commission. And it was Lazier who put it all together, the hypothesis of Finley that yellow fever is not transmitted by vapors and gases or fomites, dirty laundry and such, but transmitted by mosquitoes. And they set about testing this. And so in a very careful, controlled fashion, yellow fever, of course, while a serious disease, is not fatal most of the time. James Carroll from the University of Maryland allowed himself to be bitten by mosquitoes that had feasted upon yellow fever patients. He came down with a very bad but non-lethal case of yellow fever. And to confirm this, Jesse Lazier allowed himself to be bitten by yellow fever mosquitoes, came down with a serious case and died of yellow fever at the age of 34. So there's a commonly told story about Walter Reed demonstrating yellow fever by allowing himself to be bitten by mosquitoes, which is mythical. It was Jesse Lazier. So my life duty is to correct this myth. And if you go to the old part of the hospital, behind the dome on the brick wall is this plaque, which was the first information I had about Jesse William Lazier, Baltimore, Johns Hopkins, and how he died and come out of Cuba in September 1900. So Walter Reed had returned to the United States while this testing was going on, and he was wired with the information and interpreted correctly that, in fact, yellow fever was a vector-borne disease, and other individuals were tested and confirmed that mosquitoes could transmit yellow fever. And in October 23rd of 1900, just 6 weeks after the death of Lazier, he presented this hypothesis at a meeting of the American Public Health Association, which was being held in Indianapolis. And he presented it, and the discussions went way over time. There was a lot of interest. They were able to publish the work 4 days later. We think about electronic publishing being fast, but in 1900, they could publish this in the Philadelphia Medical Journal 4 days after the publication. And it created a lot of interest in the medical community. But it was not universal. The Washington Post responded to the story by dismissing it, describing this as the silliest hypothesis beyond belief. Well, the Post was wrong. Lazier and Finley were right. So this painting on display at the Cuban National Academies represents, this is just a cell phone photo, it's not very high quality, but here's Finley at a meeting with Walter Reed, James Carroll, Jesse Lazier. So as part of our visit of the Health Advisory Board, we felt that a plaque similar to the plaque in honoring Lazier should be replaced in the Cuban Academy of Sciences in memory of Finley and Lazier, both, it's in Spanish, who demonstrated that mosquitoes transmitted yellow fever, which led to the control of yellow fever. Within 1 year of this observation, the ability to control mosquitoes was vigorously employed in Havana. Instead of having their usual hundreds of deaths, there was not a single death. It was a major public health advance. And here are some of the original drawings from Walter Reed's notebooks, which are still in existence. Here's the camp, which they subsequently named Camp Lazier in memory of Jesse Lazier. So part of the revolution was due to the problems with public health and medical care in Cuba before the revolution. And Castro, Guevara, and the other leadership decided early on that they would make healthcare a primary effort in Cuba, first off available to all Cubans. It would be a mechanism to generate physicians for the needy parts of the world. And they started a new medical school. This medical school was actually just started in the late 1990s. The Latin American Medical School, which is the largest medical school in the world. It's just outside of Havana. They have 10,000 students. They graduate over 2,000 students a year. And how they can educate all of these people in medicine is quite a challenge. I can't explain it all. I suspect these are not Johns Hopkins, Washington University, Stanford physicians, but maybe what we would consider physician assistants. We're able to care for many of the needs, but maybe not all of the needs. But it's been a huge success, and I think a significant benefit to the economics of Cuba. So the physicians that attend the Latin American Medical School come from 80 countries around the world, largely from disadvantaged backgrounds, and they're given a free education and expected to return to their home countries to take care of the poor, or in other countries around the world. So Cuba, with a population of 11 million people, graduates about 5,000 medical doctors each year, about half from the Latin American Medical School, and currently more than 50,000 Cuban-trained physicians are working around the world in places like Venezuela, in the Western Hemisphere, in Congo, Angola, and places of need. The recent Ebola crisis was met by the largest contingents were from the United States and from Cuba. The initial Cuban brigade of 190 medical personnel went to Sierra Leone. And by the end of the crisis, more than 400 Cubans had gone to the Sierra Leone to work on the Ebola crisis with tremendous positive results. Scientific infrastructure was also developed. This is the campus of the Genetic Engineering Biotechnology Institute outside of Havana. This is the Center for Immunology, Molecular Immunology, Center for Cuban Biopharma. Another activity is the development of medicines in Cuba and distribution around the world. Of course, because of the embargo, the United States was not part of this. And some of the products have been enormously successful. I understand the best meningococcus group B vaccine is manufactured in Cuba. Protein, which has been of great significance in the treatment of diabetic foot ulcers, which is a expressed human epithelial growth factor injected into the ulcers of the diabetic foot ulcers with very positive results. Again, available around the world, but not in the United States because of the embargo. Here I am photographed with some of the leaderships of the Genetic Engineering Biotechnology Institute. And these are two directors of the Cuban Research Institutes. This is a few years back. This is a nice photo. Their Neuroscience Institute is led by the gentleman shown on the right, Pedro Sosa Valdez. And on the left is Mark Reisman from the University of Illinois. These two gentlemen were childhood friends in Chicago. Pedro's family, being Cuban after the revolution, returned to Cuba where he grew up and stayed there. And now they're both neuroscientists collaborating actively. Friendships. So this is a luncheon that held with members of the AAAS and the son of Fidel Castro. We call him Fidelito. He's shown here. He looks a lot like his father. This is, I think, 2013. Fidelito leaned forward during that lunch and told Alan Rollback from Rutgers and me that his father would like to meet us. I honestly didn't believe I'd be having a meeting with Fidel Castro, El Comandante. And it wasn't because we were in trouble. So we spent an evening meeting with members of the Castro family. So here's Alan Rollback, a professor of environmental sciences at Rutgers University. Here's the Cuban environmental scientist, interpreter, and these are the Castro family. You recognize this one. To say we had a conversation is a bit of an exaggeration. 99% of the talk was, and he had a lot to say. And this is his charming wife. Here's Fidelito, and here's son number 2, Fidel Antonio, who's an orthopedic surgeon for the Cuban national baseball team. So what do you talk about with Fidel Castro for an evening? Or what do you listen to? And he talks like this. And he talks like this. Very exuberant. Not mirthful, but very positive. Clearly the most dynamic person I've ever met in my life. And he talked about all kinds of things. The Bay of Pigs invasion. How they did Kennedy a favor by closing it down right away. They dreaded the 1960 election because they felt if Richard Nixon had been elected, the 82nd Airborne would be sent to Cuba. Instead, it was a small contingent. He reflected on the other US presidents, mostly negatively. And the CIA, Allen Dulles and the CIA, which was a favorite topic, apparently, for him to criticize. The CIA, of course, led for multiple failed attempts to assassinate Castro. He was not a big fan of Lyndon Johnson, for that matter, or Ronald Reagan. And we didn't get into Carter or Bill Clinton, but he had a lot of opinions. He shared his view of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a little different from what our historical books shared. In fact, his take was the Cuban Missile Crisis was something he had no alternative. When they needed supplies, the Russians would send a ship. Always, they could rely upon the Soviets. And when the Soviets announced that they were going to put missiles in Cuba, Castro objected. He sent Che Guevara to Moscow to try to negotiate, but there was no way out. So we had the famous Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the world to the edge of war, but they held out. So by the end of the evening, we shook hands. There are many things we talked about that we all agreed on in terms of universal health care. Science is the way forward. So here we are shaking hands. I'm sure this ended any chance I had run for political office in the United States. And here's Fidelito. Now Fidelito, Fidel's son, came to Johns Hopkins in March for a special meeting Mike Clegg had with the department chairs. It was not publicized for security reasons. You wouldn't want to necessarily put this on public radio. Come meet Castro Jr. But Mike can tell us what the conversations were like, but he's a scientist. He views us as colleagues and friends. And the week before Fidelito came, his son, also named Fidel Castro. This is like a Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel. Everybody in Cuba is named Fidel Castro. Fidel Antonio, who came here also and gave us a talk to the School of Public Health, which we announced 2 hours before, and asked our students to share the information, and they did, and the room was packed. Social media, very powerful. So Fidel Antonio is a physicist doing some nanoscience work in Cuba and looks forward to returning to Johns Hopkins. These are our friends. And here's Fidel Antonio. It's not a very good photograph of the group of the students here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. So the fourth generation, this is Fidel Castro IV. He's 12 years old. Great-grandson of Fidel Castro El Comandante, his brothers Rafael and Gonzalo. So I shared my grandchildren's pictures with Fidel Castro's son, and he sends this right back. I think the friendships, once established, will continue. And I get holiday cards from the Castro family, not Christmas cards. I don't think we're really that chummy, but it gives me a special feeling of warmth. So I'll close by talking about the students in Cuba. This is the edifice for the University of Havana, a beautiful campus in central Havana. Nice architecture. Here I'm photographed with some of the university leadership. But the real reason to go there was to meet the students, the young people of Cuba. These are not communists. These are young scientists. And they invited me to lecture there. This is when I first met Luis Alberto on his campus. And following my lecture, I was swarmed on the podium. Now, I don't expect that this afternoon. But these young people were highly enthusiastic about science. This is the chemistry students at the University of Havana. They see the United States as a place to do scientific graduate studies, postdoctoral studies. We have every reason to proceed. So in closing, I'd just like to share, as we get older in our careers and look back, and as I do now, the things that we accomplished in the laboratories or in the clinics are important. The lessons we delivered in the classrooms were important, but the friendships we made in science are lifelong. And they may be the most important of all. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend, Luis Alberto Montero Cabrera, the chairman of chemistry from the University of Havana, the president of the Cuban Chemical Society, who we've invited to be a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins this semester. He's on the Homewood campus. I attended his physical chemistry lecture this morning, and I even understood part of it. The lecture was delivered with such clarity that a non-physical chemist can understand it. So Luis, would you join us on the podium, and we'll welcome your questions for the next half hour or so. Mike, did you want to share anything at first?
No, I think, as I said when I introduced you, yeah, I'll do it up here. So, as I said when I introduced you, Peter has a passion for bringing people together and for using science for global diplomacy. So, he's made several trips to North Korea, has been going to Cuba for some time, and chaired the AAAS Committee on Human Rights. And when we were recruiting Peter to our school, one of the, I think, compelling reasons to get him back, besides his desire to have an impact on health on a grand scale and help to eliminate and eradicate malaria, was the fact that that as a school, we're so concerned about social justice and about human rights. And the fact that we had a very active Center for Human Rights was, I think, instrumental in having having him come back to Baltimore. So I'm very happy that we have Luisa. I hope you're not going to talk about physical chemistry.
You won.
Nothing beyond second-order equations, I hope so.
Driving the Boltzmann equation for us.
Was sufficient for
Yeah.
today.
And
So you're welcome to ask questions while we're waiting for the.
we have to use the microphone so that it's being recorded.
So while you're getting your questions ready, I'll ask Luis, could you share some of your experiences? You were a youth in Cuba during the revolution, the entry of the rebels into Havana. You stayed after the revolution. You developed a scientific career in spite of all of our national animosity. You got upbeat.
It was a curious situation because, in fact, we were at that time in the 60s very enthusiastic for science. At that time were the years of the Sputniks and the years of the challenges of the space, and we were. I was talking with Peter about something that I cannot decipher up to now, because you mentioned that in your talk. Fidel Castro is a person with a typical political and low education. His family has no antecedents of science. His environment, in times when he developed, was completely out of science. In fact, the Cuban science before revolution truly was in a very poor situation. There is a famous report by Truslow it was a commission from the Inter-American Bank in 1951, 40-something, 51, telling about the poorness of the development of knowledge in Cuba at that time. And Fidel Castro was educated at that time. And for any reason, I cannot decipher it, he became so early as 1960, you mentioned that the future of Cuba must be a future of men and women of science. It was at that time truly completely useful. In fact, this is recorded and historical, but I was at that time 30 years old, and I read newspapers, and I do not remember the moment when it was reported in the newspaper that I mean, it was clear that it was not the first title in a newspaper. It was a site, no news at that time. And it was completely astonishing. And I entered the university in '64, and the environment in the university was for doing science, and the borderline for all our proposals was science. And at that time was created the National Center for Scientific Research, very near to the building you showed here. You can see it behind that. And it was the first great scientific institution in Cuba. There were other centers of research created since '64. '63 was the first one, an experimental field for pasture, for food for cattle. And I cannot explain myself why the so influent and so politically oriented person like Fidel was so interested by science. And I belong to a generation mostly influenced by that. At that time, being a scientist became from being nothing practically before revolution to be an important person. I was, of course, as a youngster, I wanted to be useful for the society. And we joined science at that time. Even the engineers made the same. There were things that must be remembered. In 1969, came to Cuba a person from here who was familiar with the building of computers, PDP computers. We're talking about third generation computers at that time, the first small computers built. And at that time, the PDP 11 or PDP 9, I don't remember, was the one. And that man more or less talked with a Cuban engineer from our faculty of technology at that time, and they were documented, and they told Fidel, well, we can build a computer. Of course, it was completely out of relation with the person who came to get the initiative from here. And they got money for going to Japan to buy parts, buy components. And this person took 6 months himself. Ingeniero Ramos from the Faculty of Technology passed away already. And he designed the computer. And they built the computer. And once they called Fidel, by the director of the Center of Research, they called Fidel and told him, we have a computer able to play chess with you. There are several versions if the computer won or not. I cannot assure, I was not there. But clearly, you could imagine that a country like Cuba, having no presidency, the only computer I mentioned today, the only computer we had was a second generation computer from Britain, Elliott 803B, because we were unable to buy computers here. And our first calculation in quantum chemistry, I'm a theoretical chemist, was being made in that computer, very primitive computer. And they produced, only 4 years after, a computer that was relatively competitive at that time. Clearly, the future of that computer was clearly very poor, because the big market of USA was not present, the supplies of parts were not present, but it was a reflection of the talent that my generation dedicated to produce science. That's what I wanted to illustrate here with your question. And after that, of course, we educate the new people for science. We are not now in our best situation. We are now very deeply going to our yield in science. We are among the 6 more productive countries in Latin America. Of course, after us, there is Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Chile. They are much more large countries like us than us, but we must now work harder to maintain and to go forward in science. But the big question is, I cannot answer that. Why Fidel was so interested? If you look at the politicians in Latin America, even the newest politicians, this inclination for science is not remarkable. I don't know.
There's some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you. Perhaps my understanding of English is poor. Please speak slowly to.
You are very intelligent. I will speak slowly.
Perfect. I understand that.
There we go. No, it's a very simple question. Dr. Montero, how are your scientific institutions and your medical education institutions funded, particularly in the current context of less funds coming in from external sources, et cetera, et cetera?
As far as I know, more than 50% of the Cuban budget is dedicated to education and health. And that funding is for all education, the whole education of the country, including medical education and services. And it is a big load for the Cuban economy. Mostly silent load, because you never know how much are you paying of that big load. But it is on the other side, it's a source of happiness, because you cannot imagine how careful I am, for example, to get sick abroad, because I never know how to manage that. But in Cuba, I immediately know how to do for everything, and I go to any place and I receive the best attention possible for free. Nobody asks me other than my name and my age. Probably in the future they will also ask for my number of identity card, because now we are in the way to create the electronic reports for health. But it is truly a big advantage. But we must be aware that it is also a big load. There is a way to educate physicians that apparently I cannot say it seriously because I am not related to that field, but apparently it's quite successful. That is the way to educate them with basic sciences in the first 2-3 years. But even since that time, they are becoming part of the staff in the Center for Giving Public Health Services. I mean, they are getting practice from the very early times of their education. And this perhaps also alleviates, in a certain way, the load of the price of medical services. I must say that occasionally I have had the necessity to go to a physician in other country, mostly to the dentist. And I realized that the way we treat patients is not glamorous. We fail in the nicest presence. But what I can say is that the physician I have in front of me when he taking care of me, or she is taking care of me, the majority of our women, is to give health to me. And this, from my point of view, for me, I feel much more safe than any other thing. My sister-in-law, she's a physician too, and she's doing a very popular expression in Cuba. When I am abroad, she said, when I am abroad trying and involved in private medicine, I must try to get the patient and for the patient mostly to be himself satisfied, but meaningless how much takes his attention. When I have a patient here in this country, my main purpose is to cure him. And that's a very teeny detail, but that signify how me as a patient feel when I am in front of the physician. He's wanting to cure me overall.
More questions? Clive, I think some hands in the back also, but start with Clive.
Central America really has a very strong scientific background, particularly in tropical diseases. I think of Jacinto Converse, who was in Venezuela and worked on leishmaniasis. There are many figures in Brazil as well who, in this period of time that you were talking about, the beginning of the revolution, that science was very active. So it's not, to me, strange that an astute politician could look that way. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the impact of that really is shown now with the advent of Zika, where in your country there have been something like 5 cases recorded in the epidemic.
Zika,
yeah.
30. 3 only originated in Cuba.
Yes,
the other 27 coming from
because the infrastructure of the health system is so good.
Well, I agree with you. Perhaps the times in the 60s was more or less oriented that.
Yes.
I have a question about, unrelated to some of the previous conversations, about climate change. Because
About?
climate change.
Climate.
Global warming.
Perhaps
Because,
Peter knows more about that.
well, I had a chance to visit Cuba a year ago, and I was struck by the fact that you have all these old cars, which you have to replace, and you have an opportunity to actually replace them with electric cars, and you have wind and solar in large amounts in Cuba and a limited island. So you're a perfect model for having a renewable energy infrastructure for your country. I wonder if you could comment about whether there's thinking about that and, as a way of being a model for the world.
Lift the embargo. I agree completely with you. In fact, recently I began to do something that I never before practiced in a very repeated way, is to write some very short journal article for a Cuban site, a website named Cuba Debate. And I write about science, is what I can say. And I practically refer to that theme. What I'm trying is to encourage our people related to science, to join that kind of research. We must change dramatically in the following years the structure of many science in Cuba, in order to improve it, in order to modernize it. And I think that one of the big issues is just to find where the big innovative efforts must be made. I think that it could be an excellent point for good cooperation between Cuba and USA. In fact, in the last month I have been very privileged. One of the main privileges is to be here with you. The other was that we were invited, 3 people from the scientific Cuban community by the American Chemical Society, to a meeting in New York, in Washington, in the Club of Press, the National Club of Press, something like that. And we were asked about Cuban science. And there, my colleagues, the physicist, vice president of the Academy of Science, and the dean of my faculty of chemistry, we were just expressing that. One of the things that came to the board was that the USA is dedicating from the budget of this country $20 million every year to improve democracy in Cuba. I told the person in charge there from the government, I told him, you know, the problem of democracy in Cuba is our problem. And we know how to manage that. It's better even not to be too shit from abroad, because if you too shit from abroad, imagine that the problem of democracy of this country could be encouraged by I don't want to mention any country, by another country. And it would be not nice for Americans to know that all the people are encouraging you to be democratic. And it's the same in our case. Even it hinders our own efforts to be better in the field of democracy. If they dedicate that $20 million to improve to finance exchange in science between Cuba and USA, you know how wonderful it could be? Science, looking for knowledge. It is not political, it's nothing. It's only knowledge, being more savant than before. It could be an excellent purpose.
There's another question at hand.
One more question. Can we squeeze in just one or maybe 1.5, and then we have a break at 3:30 outside, and then we're back in here at 4? Can we squeeze in 2 quick ones?
Green sweater, student, I think. Yes, it is.
Great talk. Could you just kind of speak, it seems from the lecture and from what both of you have been saying that the collaboration and the overlap of public health practice and clinical practice has been very strong ties in Cuba. Could you speak to maybe the success or the certain projects where both of those paths have really been successful and have shown a difference in the lives of Cubans?
Sure. Well, when I was a medical student at Johns Hopkins in the mid-'70s, it was made known that the medical preferences of the Cuban medical students were somewhat different. Public health was not one of the top draws for American medical students, in part because probably the salaries of public health physicians are lower than other physicians, particularly surgeons. Cuba was different. Only the top 10% of medical students were allowed to concentrate in public health because they wanted the very best students. And so I think there's been somewhat of a top-down emphasis on preventive medicine. And the medical technology I briefly described, the biopharma Cuba, the Finley Vaccine Institute, have concentrated on developing medicines to prevent people from getting sick, vaccines. And so I think there's been somewhat of a philosophical difference in the orientation that has probably been to the Cuba's great advantage. It's obvious that it's much more affordable to prevent people from getting sick than to rescue those unfortunate people who are seriously ill. Did I answer your question? I think since I was a student, there's been a sea change and great increase in the interest in public health amongst American students. Mike, what was it? 1975, there were 12 faculties of public health. Now there are 45.
Yeah, so I think when Al became dean in 1990, there were something like 40 schools. When DA became dean, there were 20. There are now 60 schools, but there were no MPH programs outside of schools when DA became. Now there's 120. So, and then the enrollment in each of those schools has increased exponentially.
And as you can see on our campus, the students come from top backgrounds. It's going to translate for really good things for our country. I think we're following a trend that was established in Cuba. Jimmy, we're out of time. Is that one more question? Yes, please.
Thank you. In my fortunate travels in conjunction with public health around the world, I've encountered a number of very well-trained physicians trained in Cuba and a few scientists, all of whom were obtaining additional training in labs in South America, in Asia, in the Middle East. What becomes of those people when they get back to Cuba? Do they have an opportunity to participate in science, or are they swept aside, or do they not come back?
And this is a very key question now. We are exporting. You know, these figures on how many Cubans with higher education are export we in the same lapse of time. There is a figure from the OECD. It's an organization for economic development, and we are exporting 1/4 of the graduate people that China is exporting. You could imagine how we already graduated after revolution more than 1 million people, 1,200,000 people, 200,000 people for higher education. Of them, probably they are abroad 300,000, 400,000. And that means we are a big exporters of educated people. The reasons are clear. The reasons are mostly economic reasons. Our salaries, my salary is truly a very low salary. And the conditions of life in Cuba are not buoyant, are sometimes hard conditions of life. And most of us, we prefer to remain there, going out for walking, getting some money and returning. Others prefer to migrate. That's a normal way for many countries in the world, with the only situation that we are mostly exporting educated people. We are also exporting non-educated people, of course, but we are exporting mostly educated people. How they do when they return, that depends the way they decided to live. If they decided to immigrate, mostly they are not returning. Now there is a policy of repatriation that facilitates people to want to return to be Cuban residents. All Cubans, we are Cuban nationals. We have all of those, we have the right for a passport. But for having the rights of a Cuban living in Cuba, of public health, we must be residents in Cuba. Public health, free education, things like that. And there are around 40,000 people a year applying for returning. People who emigrated a long time ago, 30, 40 years ago, they are returning. That's a kind of return. Of course, when they regain the right to be a resident in Cuba, they have all the opportunities as any common Cuban living there. Most of my colleagues who emigrated are all the time maintaining the door open to return. Clearly, I can tell you, probably depends mostly on how we improve our condition of life. It depends on that. How we improve our condition for walking. Sometimes, for example, there are persons who have a very particular and specialized field of walking science, and they have no possibility to develop that in Cuba. They must change their field if they return. I mean, this is strongly depending on the way the future evolves and the way the Cuban community or the Cuban country, Cuba, establish normal relation with your country.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think this will conclude our program. Thank you for your interest. And Luis Alberto, thank you so much.
Thank you to you for inviting me.